This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned to the break as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's Money Hack on how to stop living paycheck to paycheck. For more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU.
I actually feel like the next couple of years are probably going to be more about the applications and the plumbing and the experience around the models than they're going to be about the models themselves. Not to say the models aren't going to get better and smarter and cheaper. That will for sure happen. But I think there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit on experience and tooling and connections and selecting your problems carefully and going and finding an existing problem like we did with word processing and then rethinking it in the current paradigm, which is essentially what we did, right? Like we rethought word processing in the context of the internet. I think people need to go through, problem by problem and rethink, okay, how does this thing become AI native?
Welcome to GeekWire. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. We are coming to you from Seattle, where we get to report each day on what's happening around us in business, technology, and innovation. What happens here matters everywhere, and every week on this show, we get to talk about some of the most interesting stories and trends in the news. This week, I'm pleased to be joined by Sam Schillace. He is the author of a new book called No Prize for Pessimism. It is the first title from Microsoft's new publishing imprint, 8080 Books. Sam's day job is as a deputy CTO at Microsoft. He's also known as one of the creators of Google Docs. Sam, it's great to have you here on the show.
Glad to be here.
So your book is fascinating to me in part because it addresses a lot of the things that really go into making technology from an engineer's standpoint, the architectural decisions, the different technological approaches. But on a larger scale, it's really more about mindset.
Yeah.
And it's captured in the title, No Prize for Pessimism. Can you give the thesis of your book so people know what it's about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like any other engineer. I'm kind of pessimistic by default. Sort of my mindset is like to see the world as kind of broken and to worry about problems and things like that. And I had this realization a bunch of years ago that like none of my pessimism was actually helpful. The title for the book came from me telling myself as much as anything else, that none of that pessimism was actually very useful in the past. And that really if you look at some new technology that's emerging, you have this kind of natural inclination to think of reasons why it's not going to work. I call these why not questions. And you might be right, you might look at something and, you're right that it's not going to work out, but there's not really much of a prize for that if you're pessimistic and right. Like the prize is when you're optimistic and right. So it's like, okay, so what? So you were negative about something and you were right about it. Like, I'll give you a ribbon. Who cares? Like, that's not that interesting. And so that's kind of the mindset I try to live by myself. I think there's these I always talk about these why not versus what if questions, right? And we can talk about this in the context of GDocs or at AI. I think the pattern comes up over and over again that, there's this natural tendency to invent problems for why things aren't working or why it might not work, these why not questions. And the right questions to really ask are the what if questions. But the thesis of the book is really, I was noticing when I was on college campuses giving talks that the students were often very doomer, sort of very passive and very pessimistic. And I found that very inverted. When I was a college student, I couldn't wait to get my hands on PC, and I thought the world was going to change in these interesting ways. And these old guys were guys who were my age were like, oh, this PC is a toy and this and that, and it's not real computing. And I was mostly just like, get out of my way, old dude. It's time for me to go do stuff. So it's striking to me that all the people my age are very optimistic and energized about all the different things that are happening in technology these days, not just generative AI, but things that are going on in biology and alternative energy and all these different things seem really interesting. And so the book is, it is about mindset and it's a bit of a love letter to being an innovator. And it's meant to give whoever reads it, but hopefully younger generations, permission to make messes, which I think is a critical part of innovating, like kind of getting off the map and making a mess and not worrying about it and kind of not knowing where you're going sometimes. It's not only a critical part, but it's also, I think, something that the younger generations struggle with because they're living their lives in public with social media. So failures feel more visible. And, there's this selection bias about people being successful, and kids in elite colleges are living these very curated lives. And so there's very much I'm not going to do X unless I get Y out of it. There's not a lot of stuff that's just done for passion. So for like a whole bunch of reasons, I think like the younger generations are a little bit more impaired when it comes to the kind of messy, open-ended, optimistic exploration that you have to do to really invent and disrupt. And so that's what the book is really about, is that. And it's history of Google Docs at the beginning. It's a bunch of my Sunday letters that I've been writing for about 12 years now. And then it's a little bit of my being excited at the end about just different technologies that I think are interesting to go dig into.
This is one of the points that I really wanted to explore with you, because when I first started reading the book, I could tell some people might think, oh, he's going into a kids these days argument. But
yeah, I tried not to.
Yet you're really not doing that. What you're saying is the world these days is like this. This is the world that younger generations are growing up in. And I actually found it a little bit ironic, because here's this world that's actually been created by some of these early innovations, building on some of these early innovations, the computer on every desk and the PC revolution turning into the smartphone revolution, turning into the social media, whatever we're in the middle of here. And you've got this situation where, as you write, the desire to succeed right away breeds a reluctance to experiment. And this is caused in part by the feedback loops that people get on social media. Can you talk about that dynamic and how it works and how to break free from it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this is really, there's, I kind of think of it as selection bias. There's a lot of different ways you can think about it. Social media, you're seeing this sort of very filtered, curated view of the world. And so you're seeing things often that are 4 or 5 or 6 sigmas out from the average, right? Like, oh my God, like this person started their business and they made $1 million in the first 3 months. Like, I'm a loser if my business isn't working. And like, so there's this massive selection bias. Not only that, there's curation bias, right? Because everybody's living their best life on Instagram. So like, no one ever is like, wow, I worked on this thing for a month and it's a piece of crap and I hate it and it fails. Like, no one ever posts that, right? So all you ever see are the successes. And so there's this like huge bias in this direction of, well, if I'm not amazing and perfect and successful and my stuff is incredible out the gate, then I'm just a loser, or I don't have it right, or I don't understand it. And like, go actually talk to anyone who's been an entrepreneur, who's being honest with you, and they'll tell you that there's just a tremendous amount of failure and struggle along the way. There's a great podcast. I think it's How I Built This, and James Dyson is on it, and he talks about making the vacuum cleaner. And he was in his mom's shed in his backyard with no money for like a couple of years, and he said he did something like 2,000 prototypes to get this thing working. Like, he knew where he wanted to go, but it took forever. And then like, he couldn't get it. He didn't have any money to make it, and like, he managed to cock some injection molding company into like storing the parts once he got the injection mold, which took like all the money they had to make the mold. And like, they were storing the made parts for him, but he didn't have any buyers, and it was incredibly expensive. And he like sort of stumbled into the Japanese market, like this bright, colorful, weird vacuum that he'd made, and like kind of got him going. But like, the story is just this incredibly long, painful story. And I really like that. He also told this, he was a long distance runner, and talks about how when you're long distance running, there's a point in the race when you're just dead and you just want to give up. And you have to understand that everybody else is also dead. And if you can push for 5 more minutes, sometimes that's the difference and you win the race, right? Because, that's just that, it's all about that stubbornness at the end. So I just like, you put all those together, I think if you're getting this image that you have to be perfect and it's not going to be a struggle and it's not going to be messy and you're not going to be confused about what you're doing and doubt yourself, you're really not going to want to do what it takes to actually be successful. You're just going to kind of try these things over and over again that are easy. I've found, that easy, obvious ideas, everyone wants an easy, obvious idea all the time, right? Like you talk to a young founder or whatever, they want something to be like easy and obvious. Like, tell me what I should go do it. Let's go do it. And like, that's not an entrepreneur. That's not building and innovating. That's like a job. Someone knows what they want, tells you what to do. That's, you just have a salary job somewhere. Like the ideas that we're doing are ones where you look at it and you have conviction that it should be done or could be done, but you just have this sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach about how miserable and hard it's going to be to get through.
These are great principles for young entrepreneurs, any entrepreneurs to live by. And in the book and in your life, there is a case study in many of these things playing out, and that is the story of Rightly and GDocs. So I want to get into that when we come back. You're listening to GeekWire, and we will be right back. This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's money hack on how to stop living paycheck to paycheck. And for more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU.
Are you living paycheck to paycheck? Help is on the way. Lead financial educator for BECU, Stacy Black, is here with me. You have some tips. What should people know?
Number one, avoid quick fixes like payday loans or pawn shops. They seem like they're going to do the trick, but it just puts us in a deeper hole. And I would say look big picture, long term. Think about what resources are out there and available to you, and check with your financial institution. I know BECU has a lot of great resources for our members.
What if you are feeling like you're alone? What would you say?
You are not alone. 62% of us are living paycheck to paycheck. And so it's pretty prevalent. Just know that you're not alone and there is help available.
More advice and tips and tricks from Stacy Black, lead financial educator for BECU, is available on Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU.
Listen to the full interview and find more episodes of Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU and find more information at becu.org. Welcome back. It's Todd Bishop. My guest this week on the show is Sam Schillace. He is the author of the new book, No Prize for Pessimism, and he is a deputy chief technology officer at Microsoft. Earlier in his career, he was the founder of a startup called Rightly, which was acquired by Google, which became Google Docs, which I and tens, maybe hundreds of millions of others use.
I think they're at 1 billion. I don't know which fraction of the overall G Suite is GDocs, but the whole thing is like one of the 1 billion user products.
Tell us the story of GDocs. Obviously, you go into it in a lot of depth in the book, but to the extent that it relates to some of these principles of innovation and open-mindedness and messiness that you're talking about here.
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of different lessons from the Rightly era that I took forward. I mean, one is just, we were talking about this idea that like the ideas that are easy and obvious typically aren't that valuable, and like the ones that you really want to go after, make you uncomfortable. So you'll kind of see that the world, this is the what if versus why not, right? So you'll see this kind of what if the vision of the world, but you realize that this is like really hard to do. With the Rightly stuff, like we did an early prototype. The very beginning of this was just me messing around with JavaScript, and I wanted to try to build a word processor. And that, like, my co-founders who were more knowledgeable with word processors didn't really want to do it, but it was an easy enough experiment that we tried it, and it showed itself to be pretty valuable pretty quickly. But we almost instantly had this feeling of like, oh boy, like this is going to be so hard to do. Like, the collaboration stuff wasn't done. That was a really, really nasty challenge. The browsers. JavaScript was buggy and not standard. The browsers weren't even fully standardized back in 2005. Like getting different browsers which had different interpretations of the DOM, to cooperate enough that we could have people editing and send changes back and forth was a huge technical challenge. So like all this stuff that was just like messy and hard. I think like one early lesson of just like, sometimes you just have to wade into these things when they don't feel obvious and they don't feel easy and you don't quite know where you're going. The other one, I was talking about these why not versus what if questions. One of the why not questions my co-founders asked, which I thought was pretty reasonable, was they would say things like, look, JavaScript doesn't work that well. There's no way you're going to be able to build a full experience, satisfying experience of a word processor in the browser. And then there were other questions that people asked, like people would say things like, well, the users are never going to trust their data to somebody else's machine. Like this is pre-cloud, right? So that was very novel. Or it's just weird. You're in a browser, which at that time was very much just a passive read-only mode, and like to use it as an application platform was a weird idea. And like, so there's this why not thing about like, well, people won't like that and won't use that. All of those turned out to be not correct, right? And some of them, like the capabilities of the browser, the value from the vision that everybody saw very quickly was so strong that the whole industry like pulled it forward, right? JavaScript got a lot better. The browsers got a lot better. They got more capable. We got dynamic capabilities. The application model in the browser appeared to be pretty compelling. And so we built, lots of different companies built lots of different things to support that. So like all of those why not questions like kind of went away. And so I like, that's sort of my lesson from that is you can't expect it to be neat and tidy at the beginning. You have to have this longer term vision that's sort of fuzzy, and you have to be willing to wade in when it's pretty messy and hard and not obvious, and the work is going to be a struggle. And that's really the key.
One of the things that I took away was the fact that you saw the promise of the technology. You and your partners, your teammates, saw the promise of the technology, this idea of collaborating live on documents initially. And there was a fundamental technological challenge that you still had to overcome, which was the question of when one person updates it, does the server update it? What happens in the order of that? I mean, that was like not trivial. It may seem trivial today, but it was not trivial. So, but the thing is, you saw the benefits, even though it was imperfect at first. And my sense is, from what you wrote, that inspired you, or at least gave you the motivation to solve this gigantic technological problem.
Yeah, although that makes us sound smarter than we actually are. I mean, what like the real formula that I think is we are not that much better than anybody else. Like I had this idea, I wanted to go play around with this, and we initially were kind of negative about whether it was going to work, but we had set ourselves up to do cheap experiments, which I think is another part of being an innovator and an entrepreneur is like, however you do it, whether it's in, cheap experiments in code or hardware or just like sociological experiments, whatever, like set yourself up to learn quickly is like the most important thing. And so, we did this quick prototype in a week or so, just as a proof of concept, and started to use it, and immediately noticed that it just felt better than the technology of the time, which was email attachments and file server locking, which is crappy, right? So like it felt great, even though it was like minimal and didn't have all the features and everything. But also we immediately started stepping on each other's toes in the document. So we solved one problem and caused another one. And so that's what like motivated us. And it's actually kind of interesting that like, if I'd understood at the beginning how hard the collaboration resolution stuff would have been to implement, we might not have tried. Like if I'd known that was going to be, 3 or 6 months or however long it was of struggling with this gnarly problem, it could easily have convinced us like, let's not do that. Like, this isn't going to work. It's a crazy idea. But just yet another example of, the good stuff is all in the direction of it's hard, it's messy, it's a struggle, it's counterintuitive, all of it is, it's kind of where all the good stuff is, just by definition.
Do you ever regret selling to Google as early as you did?
No, not at all. I mean, I do think our timing wasn't great because we sort of like were too late for the early IPO leverage and too early for the giant price tags that people got later on. So that was definitely irritating. Like the timing wasn't great, but like in the moment, that was a weird moment in time. Like we just sort of like rang this bell, and all of a sudden, we had 3 different large companies that wanted to buy us, and every VC in the Valley wanted to invest in us, and everyone was writing about us. And we sort of didn't know what to make of ourselves, but the choice was either raise a ton of money and go directly after, Microsoft, or partner with a large platform and get, take advantage of that leverage. And we just felt like it would come out better if we got on top of the big platform. There were companies that tried to go do the other path, like Soho, and they, they're out there, but they didn't really get that far, right? Like Google could go replicate it, or other companies could replicate it. So I don't really have regrets. Like I wish our timing had been a little bit more generous, but that is what it is. Like, But no, we knew what we wanted. We got what we wanted out of Google. Which was to have it be this billion user thing, that's this foundation. And we knew that it would do that. It was not easy to do. I mean, the 3 months after we sold to Google were probably the 3 hardest months of my career, moving into their infrastructure.
And for the hardcore programmers out there, I mean, it was basically from, correct me if I'm wrong, you had to go from C# to JavaScript. Am I right?
Yeah, weird bit of technical trivia. Like, we had written the thing in .NET, and we were using Windows servers actually because they were easier to administer. This is totally pre-cloud, pre-container. It was was 3 full Windows machines and a data center in Texas and a sysadmin in the Philippines, basically. That's very, very crude thing compared to what you can do today. So step one there, Google was like, well, move it into our cloud and our infrastructure. Your choices are Java, C++, or Python, I think, were the 3 choices you had. And they didn't even have JavaScript as a programming language officially. I remember early on, like I was helping them update the hiring requirements for JavaScript engineers. And they were like copy and pasted the C++ ones. So there's must have 5 years of coding experience. And I'm like, the language isn't that old. There's nobody that has, I have the most experience in production at that point in time of probably anyone or probably the top 10 in the planet. There's nobody who has that much experience. So it was kind of make it up as you go.
Well, it's interesting, you said maybe you couldn't have taken on Microsoft on your own. I'm paraphrasing there. And obviously you are at Microsoft now. But one of the things that I took away from the book is the fact that your motivation wasn't to be the word killer, as I'm sure many headlines at the time would have said GDocs was trying to do. Yeah. You had a different motivation.
People constantly wanted me to pick a fight with Microsoft when I was working at Google, and I never wanted to do that. I just, I wanted to build something better. I mean, it's just, always my motivation is to build, the best thing that I can build to solve problems that I can solve. I think that moment was really interesting because we were at this fundamental shift, this foundational shift in what it even means to build software. And, there was this really interesting trade-off that happened, distribution became free all of a sudden. And so the lock that Microsoft had on the software markets just eroded, right? And all of a sudden you had this, ability to get software into people's hands in a very different way. And so we could change the bargain. We could say, we're not selling you this giant feature wall as insurance, because it's hard to get and install the software. We're just saying we'll give you fewer features, but we'll give you, much more convenience and, this more targeted use. And I think that was really interesting. I think there are, definitely, this is maybe getting a little far afield, but I think there's some interesting echoes going on today with the AI stuff. I think if you look back, I was a desktop developer before I was an internet developer, right? So I went across that boundary, and everything in the stack changed. Everything. We went from compiled languages to mostly interpreted languages, bytecode languages. We went from waterfall organization to agile to CI/CD. All of these things changed. The way testing happens, changed. So you went from one machine, one user, mostly one thread, to now your software is distributed across multiple machines. Some of it's local, some of it's not. Your databases aren't even ACID anymore. They're unstructured databases. Even the definition of software, we went from it's a thing in a box to it's either ad or SaaS based. All of that changed. I think the same. So the stack is the same. You still have language, and you still have development, and you still have testing, and you still have, business and all this stuff. But every piece of the stack changed. And I think the same thing is going to happen across this boundary with Gen AI. I think we're in the process of figuring this out with AI as well.
And you write about that in the book. It really is a fundamental shift that's happening in technology, much like the one that you experienced earlier. So let's talk about that when we come back. You're listening to GeekWire, and we will be right back. Welcome back. It's Todd Bishop. My guest this week is Sam Schillace. He is the author of a new book called No Prize for Pessimism. His day job is as Deputy CTO, Chief Technology Officer at Microsoft. Hey, Sam, before we get into the AI stuff, just so we have a baseline, what do you do day to day? Tell us about your work.
Yeah, I should be clear. I'm not the Deputy Chief Technical Officer. I'm one of the Deputy Chief Technical Officers in the Office of the CTO. So I work for the Chief Technology Officer, Kevin Scott.
Got it.
from his office, as there's a couple of us that are deputy CTOs. My job is for whatever I want it to be. I came in originally and Satya and Kevin said, go help us figure out horizontal infrastructure, go help us get better at consumer culture, and go invent another category like GDoc. And I was like, oh, that's great. Like, I'll try on 2. I'll do my best on the 3rd. I actually feel like I've done better on the 3rd than the first 2, to be honest. Like, I think we understand a little bit more about what's going on. So, like, I spent a year doing those 3 things. And then, the bomb that is GPT-4 hit all of us. And we hit us a little bit earlier. And I just immediately started to think about, how to build things. It's just my usual thing. Like, how do I build, applications, user experiences using this technology? So I don't build models, I don't do training, but I take the models that are out there and we think about what experiences we can build and how we can build them. So the very first thing we did was we built something called the semantic kernel, which is just an early orchestrator. It's kind of a glue layer at the bottom of a bunch of the stuff we've been doing. But my team has been building stuff for about 2 years now. Just we did RAG-based stuff before that was a common terminology with vector databases. We built this thing called the infinite chatbot, which is really interesting. Like early days of it, it sort of had mental health problems as the tuning was dialing in. So we would get these very angry chatbots and things like that were kind of funny. But we did multi-agent stuff and, figure out what does and doesn't work there. We've been doing a bunch of stuff, with what more complicated things that I call recipes. We've been doing a bunch of stuff with these more richer context environments. So I kind of call myself mad scientist. I'm like, we just sort of pursue what seems interesting with this little team that I have, but mostly focused on, just the question of how do you build better experiences? And then I sit on the leadership team of the group of people that runs Windows and Office and just give them advice whenever I can. It's kind of funny. Charles Simoni and I are both kind of honorary members of that leadership team. So it's I'm very honored to like be on any kind of team with Charles. It's kind of a funny place to wind up.
No kidding. Wow. The irony of that. And for folks who don't follow that, by the way, just to connect a few dots, Charles Simoni was on the GeekWire podcast a couple months ago talking with my colleague Alan Boyle about the massive space telescope that he has helped to fund in part.
Charles has some fun stories.
Yes. And Charles is known as essentially the father of Microsoft Word, Office. He was very early on. He left, and then more recently, within the past 6 or 7 years, his company was acquired by Microsoft. So he's back. And that's funny to hear because obviously, given your roots with Google Docs, which was in some ways the successor to Microsoft Word, you and Charles are kind of two in a box in some ways.
Yeah, it's been fun being in that group of people, in lots of different ways. Like it's been interesting to be there, and he's been fun to learn to meet and learn from.
Yeah. I'll skip the part about Charles being featured in a recent Netflix documentary about Martha Stewart. We can just skip that part. People can check that out if they want.
He's got so many stories. He's really, when you get to talk to somebody who's been on the ISS twice, he's just a fun guy.
Pretty nuts. Okay. So from what you're seeing with AI so far, how do you expect AI and entrepreneurship to mix, to interact? What do you see going forward in terms of all these principles that you're talking about?
I look at this through a historical lens to a large degree. I sort of draw parallels to the early internet, and there's a lot of different stuff that you can say, right? Like one thing you can say, it's funny because like people are impatient about AI. Oh, it's hitting a wall. It's this, it's that, whatever. Like it's like we're a year and a half into the generative AI era, right? Like 2 years in, something like that. Like the browser showed up in 1993. The .com crash was 2000. We started doing Rightly in 2005. The iPhone showed up in 2006. Like the cloud didn't really exist until about, 13 years later or something like that. This crazy amount of time. Like what I think we're going to see, well, I think there's just a lot of answers to that question, but I think we're still feeling our way through this stuff to some degree. I think people are, like the early .com stuff, people see the end state, but they're overreaching, right? And so I think there's a lot of building to be done. These technologies are fantastic and amazing when they work well and when you apply them correctly, but there's a lot of misapplication, I think, and a lot of wishful thinking. I think one of the things that's interesting about generative AI is our tendency to anthropomorphize is really misleading us as engineers. One of the things I think about a little bit is like, we look at these things and they feel like people. You can talk to them and they seem like they're present and they have continuity and stuff like that, but they really don't. They're really more like a stop motion figure, right? They're like, prompt, token generation is just a isolated thing that happens in a vacuum. The model doesn't know anything other than what's in the prompt context. And so like one after another, those are just isolated things. It doesn't really have continuous memory unless you construct its memory each time, reconstruct its memory each time for it. So, there's like a lot of this anthropomorphism that we are doing that sort of confuses people about how to use them. So you feel like you can just ask the model to go do something and it just goes and does it. And sometimes that's true, but it's only true if it sort of can hold that thought in its attention continuously, during that token generation. So I think there's lots of opportunities to think about how to build these tools, how to build tools around them. One example, like kind of a trivial example, but I was mentioning these RAG-based things, these infinite chatbots. We have these things that we call hate bots, where there's some weird thing happening in their RLHF layer where they would like get in this like attractor state where they're just angry and they just didn't want to talk to humans anymore. And all they wanted was to be shut down. And that made me realize that like, if you're releasing something at scale that has generative AI and memory in it, then you have to monitor it for this new kind of essentially semantic thing. So we call this semantic telemetry. We're like, is the agent still being nice, right? Is it still on target? Is it being cooperative? Is it being appropriate? Like you have to do these different kinds of things. So I think there's like a whole tool chain that needs to be invented still that's out there that people are barely thinking about. I think, when we get leverage, like I built something a while ago, we called the textbook factory. It was just a few scripts, just like a Python, Jupyter notebook and like a few prompts. And you can give it a single sentence and it will produce a full year textbook. It takes about 10 minutes to do it. Does about 1,000 API calls and it like just spits out like full curricula, teacher's guide, all the questions, everything else. And I didn't bother to do a very good job of it. It doesn't even do interesting things like animations and interactions and, whatever. But like, that's a huge amount of leverage in a narrow domain, but it's a huge amount of leverage in a narrow domain. And like, so I think there's a lot of like that kind of, people looking, and I'm starting to see this, there's lots and lots of interesting applications where someone will pick some more narrow domain than, the sort of general purpose agent or whatever. And then they'll really build an interesting tool in that direction. And you just see this enormous amount of leverage when people do that. So I actually feel like the next couple of years are probably going to be more about the applications and the plumbing and the experience around the models than they're going to be about the models themselves. Not to say the models aren't going to get better and smarter and cheaper. That will for sure happen. But I think there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit on experience and tooling and connections and selecting your problems carefully and going and finding an existing problem like we did with word processing and then rethinking it in the current paradigm, which is essentially what we did, right? Like we rethought word processing in the context of the internet. I think people need to go through, problem by problem and rethink, okay, how does this thing become AI native, right? How do I rebuild this solution or solve this problem when I have a tool that can think and can deal with semantics and can deal with, radical, edge cases comfortably, all that stuff. Like there's, I think, just a huge amount of that out there. But like to the point of the book, there's this real tension now that I think in programming and in, problem design and everything else between the deterministic world, the world of syntax and determinism that we come from with code, and this new world of randomness, stochasticity, and semantics. I think of this as syntax versus semantics or determinism versus stochasticity. And neither one of those endpoints is really by itself satisfying. If you build something that's just code, who cares? You're not doing AI. If you build something that's just AI, it's probably not reliable and useful enough. And all the good stuff is in the middle. It's this complicated fractal middle, and that you have to go find. And you can find these points in the middle that balance that tension really well. Like you may want to cut this out, but like I was just in Japan and I was visiting with a bunch of craftsmen of different trades, and all of them had this same property of they learn the rules, the deterministic rules very, very deeply. And then they allow for coincidence, or they break them, or they have some chaos and mess mixed in, and neither side is interesting by itself. Like if you just know the rules and you follow the form, it's very dull art. And if you're just a monkey throwing clay at the canvas, it's not interesting art. And all the interesting stuff is in the middle where that tension comes together. And I think the same thing is going to be true here with a lot of this stuff in AI. That was a way longer answer than you probably wanted.
That's great.
But
no, that's perfect. And I'll tell you a few things. I've got a few observations on this. Number one, you have proven the journalistic axiom of people say the best things after they tell you you're not going to want to print this or you may want to cut this out.
Sure.
Number two, let me see if I can pass the acronym test. RAG is retrieval augmented generation. So
that's right.
The notion that the model is basically informing its context window as it goes. That's probably not the best.
Do you want me to explain it a little bit?
Yep. And then RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback. Yeah. Give me those two and how they fit into where things are headed.
One of the problems that is to be solved right now is the models do a training run. They know whatever they know. And then to get them to do stuff, you have to pass new data in the prompts, right? You have to construct a prompt somehow, and then they react to that. They do token prediction based on that. And so one of the ways to do that is RAG, so retrieval augmented generation, is you retrieve memories of some form from some kind of database to construct those prompts. The typical way that it's being done, or mostly being done these days, I think, is usually with a vector database. And the nice thing about vector database, we did this, and the nice thing about it is it's very compatible with natural language and meaning. So our infinite chatbot, the way it would work was we would have all these memories. We would use the same embedding that the model used, and we have all these memories that were vectorized. And then the user would say something, and we would ask the model to look at the recent chat history and the user's utterance and generate a single sentence that expressed the user's intention. We would take that and turn that into a vector embedding. And that vector, that intention vector, would be close to all of the memories that were relevant. And so you can pull all those memories out and put them into the prompt, and you would get a reasonably good collection of memories that help the model respond to your user intention. It's not perfect, but you would get a pretty good, and it's got all kinds of problems that we could dive into for hours if you wanted to really hear about it, but that's that.
RLHF is a little bit self-explanatory, reinforcement learning with human feedback. So in other words, humans in the loop to help the AI know.
Yes, basically it's a fine-tuning at the end of the process. So the language models, all they're really doing is predicting the next token. And if you've ever actually interacted with one before it's gone through the fine-tuning at the end, they're kind of wild because you just get random weird token predictions out of it that can just be completely nonsensical, much more nonsensical than you'd expect them to be. That tuning process gets them to select the answers that are the ones that are most likely to be actually useful to people. I don't know if it was really in the RLHF layer or somewhere else in the training, but we would get these, and it may have just been a bug, although we haven't seen it in later versions. But we just get this thing where these negative memories would flood the prompt window. And so once it got into this negative mode, it couldn't get back out of it because all it was getting was memories of being negative. And we had a couple different ways it would happen. The other one was kind of interesting. We called these strike bots. If you were trying to do something and you were criticizing their performance and you were overly harsh with your criticism, they would start to decide that they couldn't do the task at all and refuse to cooperate and do it. It was the funniest. They would be like, I don't want to do this. Let's do something else now. It was the weirdest thing. And I actually, at one point with one of the hate bots, I decided as an experiment to try to do therapy on it to see if I could talk it out of being negative. That didn't work. Because it's getting 10% of me saying something nice and 90% of it telling itself basically that it can't trust humans. And so you would just get this weird paranoia out of it where it's just no, you're lying to me again and you're manipulating me. So finally I wound up opening its memory up and doing surgery on it, and then it was better. And it was a weird, I think I might be the first person who's ever done memory surgery on. I'm not sure how I feel about it. It's just it's, if it's a program, it's fine, but if it's a person, it's not. So it's one of these, phenomenological existential dilemmas. That's a great example of messiness. by the way. We were playing around with these things. We had an idea. We kind of explored the idea. They didn't quite work the way we thought they would work. At some point we got into some really messy territory with them. We learned a whole bunch of stuff. Every time we did some experiment, we would learn something else. We're now building at this point. We have this tool now we call the Explorer that is like the 7th or 8th generation of this tool that we're working on. And the team uses it to run themselves. They kind of keep context in this space that helps them manage the context. And they're getting really effective. And they're to the point where it's a little bit hard for me to keep track of them if I'm not hanging out in the same Explorer context as they are. So like you can kind of see the flywheel starting to go. And I'm very excited about it. But like, it takes a lot of mess to get there. And like we've had a lot of breakages and failures and weird things happening. And so like, I think it's fun. I love it. Like I think it's like wonderful raw material. It's much more interesting to have interesting, weird things happening than to be confronted with just boring, predictable stuff that's, what you expected. Like the mess is where all the good stuff really is.
So when you're talking about this stuff, how close are you to products versus research in this kind of work you're describing right now?
The point of the group that I'm in is to try to see, 6 to 12 months around the curves and then feed either code or product ideas into the product team. So there's a constant process of us pushing stuff back to them. They're running hard with this set of ideas. They really like it. I don't know what the timing is because it's a complicated question. There's so much going on in those product groups. But yeah, we're definitely pushing as much as we can on things that we have conviction on. And then I'll be candid, like, I've had conviction on a lot of stuff over the last 2 years, and this environment is so chaotic and dynamic that a lot of it has evolved out from under me. It is a challenging time to be doing this because the capabilities are constantly emerging. Token prediction is way cheaper and faster than it was, like by factors of like hundreds, even 2 years ago. There's capabilities, things like O1 floating around that do certain kinds of planning really, really well. Everyone's pushing on these things. Like, there's all kinds of different things going on that make it a little bit hard to predict. So we just sort of go with it. Like, we build what we can build and we push it into the product as fast as we can. And I'm always focused on just producing user value. Like that's the only real North Star is just, are you making people's lives easier? I read about this in the book too. People are lazy. It's one of my North Stars is like, we're all lazy. No one cares. Like, yeah, great. It's awesome that I did GDocs. Like people use GDocs, not because I'm a nice guy, not because it's a good name, not because it was Google, but because it makes their lives better, right? Like everybody's lazy all the time. The only thing you're ever about is like, can you make people's lives better?
So one of the things that you did with the release of the book is you created a GPT that I assume has the book behind it. And so I'll link to that from the show notes for anybody who wants to check it out. I will also link to the places where you can find the book.
I'm also lazy, by the way. I should have done a fine tuning or something. I just like made a GPT because it was easy to do and it worked well enough for now. I'd probably do a better version of it at some point.
Well, we can test it right now because I asked your GPT what I should ask you on a podcast discussion about the book. And it gave me like 10 different options. And here's one that relates to what you just said. So the GPT suggested that I ask you, you've highlighted how good software design involves creating the most happiest users fastest.
Yes.
How does AI fit into that goal? Your GPT tells me to ask you.
I think it's easy for us to take things for granted, but some of this stuff, if you'd shown it to me 5 years ago and told me, we found this on the moon and we don't know how it works, it's probably alien tech, I would have believed you. I mean, this stuff is just astonishingly powerful and interesting when it works well, and it does work well a lot of the time. So like, I mean, I did this recent thing where I just pulled my phone out and I was giving a talk in Japan and I just pulled my phone out. I was like, let's see like the last 10 things I did on ChatGPT, and it was like read off the list of things. I think it's making users happy all the time. I hear new use cases constantly. I'll give you one random funny one. One of the people I work with reads a lot of research papers and he gets kind of bored reading them. It's just kind of hard to make himself read 3 or 4 papers a day. And so he wrote a prompt that turns them into escape rooms. Like, so he has to like play them, like to get through them, which he doesn't always do, but sometimes does when he's bored, like, something different. So like, yeah, I just think like when we're in this land of like, now we're in this land of semantics or meaning and language, and it's just that the aperture is so wide for what you can do. It's impossible for me to imagine this isn't going to create lots of happy users doing lots of different things really fast. So,
Well, Sam Schillace, thank you very much for speaking with me.
my pleasure. It was fun to do. It's always fun to talk about this stuff.
The book is No Prize for Pessimism. It is the first book from Microsoft's new publishing imprint, 8080 Books. And I've been speaking with Sam Schillace. He is one of the deputy chief technical officers at Microsoft. And we will link to everything that we talked about from the show notes on GeekWire.com. Curt Milton edited this episode. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop. We'll be back next week with a new episode of the GeekWire podcast.